It is a singular and most distressing necessity that compels me to set down, in this rambling and perhaps incoherent chronicle, the dark and salt-crusted genesis of that blighted Massachusetts seaport which the world knows, or chooses to forget, as Innsmouth. To understand the shadow that hangs over those sagging gambrel roofs and the stinking, weed-choked waters of the Manoxet, one must look back beyond the Civil War, beyond the Great Plague of 1846, to the decade of the 1830s, when the sails of the Marsh fleet still commanded the respect of the mercantile world. It was a time of transition, a period when the robust spirit of New England maritime commerce began to curdle into something altogether more sinister, driven by the desperate avarice of one man, Captain Obed Marsh. The annals of the Marsh family are a grim tapestry of ambition and maritime prowess, but by the year 1832 the threads were beginning to fray. The East India trade, once the lifeblood of the town, had begun to wither under the pressure of shifting currents and the rise of more prosperous ports like Salem and Boston. Obed Marsh, a man of iron constitution and a temperament as cold and relentless as the North Atlantic, watched with mounting fury as his wharves rotted and his ledgers bled ink the colour of dried gore. The shipping business, which had sustained his lineage for generations, was failing. It was this financial desolation, this gnawing vacuum of poverty, that served as the catalyst for his descent into a darkness older than the hills of Arkham. In his desperation, Marsh turned his eyes toward the vast uncharted expanses of the South Pacific. He had heard whispers in the waterfront taverns of Singapore and the nameless ports of the East Indies, whispers of islands where the inhabitants possessed gold of a queer greenish cast, and where the reefs teemed with a life that was not entirely of this world. In 1834, Marsh set sail on the brig Sumatra, leaving the crumbling piers of Innsmouth behind in search of a fortune that would restore his family's name, heedless of the spiritual cost such a reclamation might demand. The voyage of the Sumatra was a journey into the very heart of an antediluvian nightmare. After months of navigating the labyrinthine archipelagos of the Pacific, Marsh encountered a tribe of Kanaks on a nameless volcanic isle, a people whose features bore a disturbing batrachian cast and whose religious practices were centered around the worship of entities they called the Deep Ones. These were not the gods of any recognized pantheon. They were beings of the abyss, squamous and immortal, who dwelt in cyclopean cities beneath the crushing weight of the ocean. Among these people, Marsh found a mentor in the form of a high priest named Wallachia. It was Wallachia who revealed the secrets of the summoning, the rhythmic chants and the leaden icons that could draw the attention of the things below. The Kanaks traded with these entities, offering human sacrifices in exchange for an abundance of fish and ornaments of a strange, non-Euclidean gold that seemed to glow with an inner, malevolent light. Marsh, blinded by his own material ruin, did not recoil in horror at the blasphemy of these rites. Instead, he saw in them a solution to the stagnation of Innsmouth. He learned the rituals with a feverish intensity, his mind already calculating the weight of the gold and the restoration of his own power. The initial meetings at the Pacific Reefs were characterized by a mounting tension that Marsh, in his narrative accounts, described with a chilling detachment. He stood upon the jagged coral under the light of a gibbous moon, casting the leaden trinkets into the surf and intoning the guttural sibilant syllables he had been taught. The response was not immediate, But when it came, it was accompanied by a phosphorescence that turned the black water into a churning cauldron of sickly light. Great bulging eyes broke the surface, eyes that reflected no human soul, but rather the cold, indifferent hunger of the cosmos. The trade began with small things, curios, ornaments and gold that felt unnaturally heavy and possessed a texture that repelled the touch. When Marsh returned to Innsmouth in 1838, the town was initially buoyed by his success. The Marsh gold became a thing of legend, and the captain's influence grew until he was the de facto ruler of the crumbling community. He established the Marsh Refining Company, where the strange jewellery was melted down into bars of more conventional appearance, though the workers often complained of a persistent fishy odour that no amount of fire could purge. Yet the gold was not a gift. It was a loan, and the interest was about to be called due. As the 1840s dawned, the supply of gold from the Pacific began to dwindle, and the deep ones of the Pacific were too distant to serve Marsh's needs. It was then that he conceived of a more local arrangement. He knew that the abyss was not confined to the South Seas. The ocean is a singular, interconnected void, and the things that dwelt beneath the Pacific also haunted the lightless trenches off the coast of Massachusetts. Specifically, they gathered in the shadow of Devil's Reef, a jagged outcropping of black rock 1.5 miles from the Innsmouth shore, where the water drops off into depths that no plummet has ever truly sounded. The first summonings at Devil's Reef were conducted in the dead of night, away from the prying eyes of the few remaining pious citizens of Innsmouth. Marsh and a select group of loyal, depraved followers rowed out to the reef, their oars muffled, their hearts hardened against the encroaching madness. The rituals they performed there were an escalation of the Kanak blasphemies. They did not merely ask for gold, they invited the entities to rise and take residence in the very waters of the harbour. The atmosphere of the town began to change. A miasma of decay, more profound than mere salt and rotting fish, settled over the streets. The seagulls, those harbingers of the sea's natural order, fled the harbour, replaced by a brooding silence that was broken only by the rhythmic lapping of the waves against the decaying pilings. It was during this period that the initial trade of trinkets for gold underwent a horrifying transformation. The entities beneath the reef grew weary of lead and copper. They demanded a more intimate commerce. They demanded the flesh of the land. The first disappearances were attributed to the hazards of the sea. Sailors lost in the fog, children swept away by the tide. But the truth was far more grisly. Marsh had begun a systematic program of human sacrifice, delivering the unwanted and the unwary to the things at the reef. In exchange, the gold flowed once more, and the nets of the Innsmouth fishermen were filled with strange, misshapen fish that no market would buy, but which sustained the town as it withdrew further into its own insular nightmare. However, even blood was not enough to satisfy the hunger of the deep ones. Their ultimate goal was not the extinction of humanity, but its subversion, a slow genetic conquest that would allow them to walk upon the land in the guise of men. They demanded the right to interbreed with the inhabitants of Innsmouth. This was the central horror of the pact, the shadow that would define the town for the next century. Marsh, now fully ensnared by the eldritch powers he had invoked, did not resist. He saw in this hybridization a form of immortality, a way to ensure that his lineage would endure even as the world of men crumbled. He was the first to offer his own kin to the entities, and soon the Innsmouth look began to manifest among the town's leading families. It started with a slight narrowing of the head, a widening of the eyes, and a peculiar shuffling gait. The skin became scaly and cold to the touch, and the ears began to wither as the neck developed unsightly creases that resembled gills. The transition was not merely physical, it was psychological. Those who underwent the change began to feel the call of the deep, a yearning for the cold, dark waters that eventually became more powerful than any terrestrial bond. They gathered in the esoteric order of Dagon, a mockery of a religious institution that replaced the traditional churches of Innsmouth. The hymns of the order were not songs of praise, but guttural chants to Dagon and Hydra, the primordial progenitors of the Deep Ones. By 1846, the town was a charnel house of genetic degradation. The few citizens who retained their humanity lived in a state of constant whimpering terror, barricading their doors at night against the things that hopped and stumbled through the fog-shrouded streets. The authorities in nearby towns heard rumours of strange goings-on, of devil worship and monstrous births, but the isolation of Innsmouth and the influence of the Marsh family kept the world at bay. The climax of this occurs on a night of unholy astronomical alignment, when the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest. Marsh, now an old man whose own features had begun to sag into a mask of piscine horror, led a final, massive procession to Devil's Reef. They did not go in boats this time. Many of them swam, their bodies already more at home in the brine than on the shore. At the reef they met with the emissaries of the abyss in a riot of phosphorescent blasphemy. The Deep Ones rose from the water in their thousands, great hulking forms with ridged backs and webbed appendages, their scales glistening with a mephitic slime. They brought with them the final payment for Marsh's service, a crown of gold that was not of this earth, a cyclopean artifact that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the ocean itself. But the price was the total surrender of Innsmouth. The entities would no longer wait at the reef. They would enter the town, they would dwell in the cellars and the hidden tunnels beneath the houses, and they would claim every man, woman and child as their own. The horror of that night is beyond the power of words to convey. The screams of the dying were drowned out by the rhythmic chanting of the order, a sound that rose like a tide to engulf the senses. When the sun rose the next morning, Innsmouth was changed forever. The plague that the official records claim decimated the population was in truth a purge, a culling of those who would not or could not adapt to the new order. Those who remained were no longer purely human. They were the children of the shadow, the heirs to a legacy of salt and slime. Obed Marsh lived on for many years, a recluse in his great house on Washington Street, his mind a shattered vessel of forbidden knowledge. He had achieved his goal. He had saved his fortune and his family, but at the cost of his soul and the soul of his town. He watched from his window as the wharves continued to rot, no longer caring for the commerce of men. His eyes were fixed on the sea, on the dark shape of Devil's Reef, where his true masters waited. The story of gold from the sea is a testament to the corrosive power of greed and the terrifying indifference of the cosmos. It reveals that the horrors of Innsmouth were not the result of some accidental encounter with the unknown, but were deliberately summoned by a man who chose the abyss over poverty. The Pact of Obed Marsh was a bridge built between the world of light and the world of eternal darkness. A bridge that can never be destroyed, only hidden behind a veil of silence and neglect. As one walks the crumbling streets of Innsmouth today, smelling the pervasive stench of fish and decay, one can still feel the weight of that ancient bargain. The sagging houses seem to lean toward the water, as if yearning to return to the depths from which their masters came. The people, if they can still be called people, watch with their unblinking, bulging eyes, waiting for the day when the stars are right once more, and the shadow over Innsmouth spreads to engulf the entire world. The gold, of course, remains. It is hidden in the vaults of the Marsh Refining Company, or buried in the silt of the harbour, or worn as jewellery by things that no longer have names. But it is a cursed treasure, a metal that carries within it the cold, crushing pressure of the deep and the memory of the blood that was shed to obtain it. To touch it is to invite the attention of the deep ones, to feel the first tickle of the Innsmouth look upon one's own skin. In the end, Captain Obed Marsh was not a victor, but a victim. He was a pawn in a game, played by entities whose lifespans are measured in aeons, and whose goals are as inscrutable as the trenches of the Pacific. He brought the gold from the sea, but he also brought the sea to the land, and in doing so he ensured that the name of Marsh would be whispered with a shuddering dread as long as there are men left to remember the tragedy of the Massachusetts coast. The legacy of the Sumatra and the rituals of Wallachia endure in the salt-crusted silence of the Manoxet. The bells of the esoteric order of Dagon still toll on certain nights when the moon is thin and the wind blows from the east, a funereal dirge for a town that died in the 1840s and has been rotting ever since. The shadow is not merely a metaphor. It is a physical presence, a tenebrous shroud that smothers the soul and prepares it for the long, cold descent into the abyss. And so the chronicle of Obed Marsh's pact concludes, leaving us with a vision of a world where the boundaries of the human and the monstrous are as fluid as the tides. The gold is there, beneath the waves, glowing with its sickly greenish light, a lure for the next desperate man who finds himself standing on the shore, looking out at the dark silhouette of Devil's Reef and wondering what secrets lie beneath the churning foam. But let him beware, for the sea does not give up its treasures without a price, and the deep ones are patient. They have all of eternity to collect their due, and in the end, everything, every city, every man, every dream must eventually sink into the lightless, squamous depths from which all life originally crawled. The narrative of Marsh's descent is a cautionary tale of the highest order, a grim reminder that there are things in the dark corners of the earth that were never meant to be disturbed. The Kanaks of the Pacific knew this, and they paid the price in their own blood and sanity. Obed Marsh knew this, and he condemned his entire lineage to a fate worse than death. The town of Innsmouth knows this, and it huddles in its own decay, waiting for the final, inevitable immersion. The gold from the sea is not merely wealth. It is a contagion, a biological and spiritual blight that transforms the familiar into the alien. It is the physical manifestation of the Deep One's influence, a shimmering golden hook that pulls humanity toward the crushing depths. As the fog rolls in from the Atlantic, obscuring the rotting wharves and the misshapen chimneys of the town, one can almost hear the splashing of webbed feet upon the stones and the guttural, sibilant whispers of a language that was old when the first amphibians crawled onto the mud of a cooling earth. The story of the pact is a cycle of avarice and abomination, a tragedy of cosmic proportions enacted on the stage of a small, dying New England port. It is the foundation upon which all the subsequent horrors of Innsmouth are built, the secret history of a town that sold its humanity for a handful of greenish gold and a promise of immortality in the brine. And as the narrator of these events, I find myself looking at my own reflection in the mirror with a new and terrible scrutiny, wondering if the slight widening of my eyes and the peculiar texture of my skin are merely the results of age, or if the shadow of Obed Marsh has finally reached out across the generations to claim one more soul for the abyss. The sheer density of the horror is such that the mind recoils, seeking refuge in the mundane and the known. But for those who have seen the gold, for those who have heard the chants from Devil's Reef, there is no escape. The sea is always there, its tides a rhythmic reminder of the power that dwells beneath. The commerce of Obed Marsh continues, though its ledgers are now kept in a language of symbols, and its profits are measured in the slow, agonizing transformation of the human form. In the final analysis, the prequel to The Shadow over Innsmouth is a story of a world losing its way, of a man who looked into the eyes of the infinite and found only his own reflection, distorted and monstrous. It is a tale of the sea's ultimate victory over the land, a slow-motion invasion that began with a single ship and a single desperate captain. The gold from the sea is the siren song of the deep ones, and once heard, it can never be forgotten. It echoes in the crashing of the waves, in the creaking of the old houses, and in the silence of the abandoned streets where the fog never truly lifts. Thus, the history of the Marsh family and the rise of the esoteric order of Dagon stands as a monument to the fragility of human civilization when confronted with the antediluvian forces of the cosmos. The 1830s and 40s were not merely a time of economic shift. They were the years of the Great Betrayal, when the gate was opened and the things from below were invited in. The consequences of that invitation are written in the scales and the gills of the people of Innsmouth, and in the dark, salt-stained pages of a history that should never have been recorded. As I lay down my pen, the smell of the sea is stronger than ever, filling the room with a cold, damp presence that seems to emanate from the very walls. I can hear the sound of something moving in the hallway, a heavy, wet, hopping sound that fills me with a primal, unreasoning dread. Perhaps the shadow has found me at last. Perhaps the gold of Obed Marsh is calling me home, to the reefs and the trenches and the cyclopean cities where the sun never shines, and the deep ones reign supreme. The water is calling, and I fear that, like the town of Innsmouth itself, I am finally ready to answer. The transition from the mercantile prosperity of the early 19th century to the eldritch stagnation of the mid-century was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual agonizing erosion of the human spirit. Captain Obed Marsh, in his relentless pursuit of solvency, became the architect of a nightmare that would outlast him by centuries. His voyage on the Sumatra was the first stitch in a shroud that would eventually cover all of Innsmouth. The rituals he brought back from the Pacific were the seeds of a garden that would grow only in the dark, nourished by the blood of the innocent and the corruption of the guilty. The gold itself, that greenish, unnatural substance, served as the perfect lure. It was beautiful in a way that defied earthly aesthetics, possessing a luster that seemed to shift and change like the surface of the ocean. It was a material from a non-Euclidean realm, fashioned by hands or claws that did not follow the laws of human geometry. When Marsh first displayed the ornaments in the windows of his company, the townspeople were entranced. They did not see the blasphemy in the designs, they saw only the wealth. They did not smell the salt and the slime. They smelled only the promise of a better life. But as the years passed and the Innsmouth look began to spread, the true nature of the gold became apparent. It was not a currency of trade, but a mark of ownership. Those who wore it, those who profited from it, were marked as the property of the Deep Ones. The gold was a tether, binding the town to the reef with an unbreakable chain of greed and genetic debt. The Marsh Refining Company was not a place of industry, but a temple of transformation, where the treasures of the abyss were processed into the shackles of the land. The 1840s were the crucible in which the modern Innsmouth was forged. The plague of 1846 was the final cleansing, the moment when the last vestiges of the old world were swept away to make room for the new. The sacrifices at Devil's Reef reached a fever pitch, the water turning red under the light of the moon as Marsh and his followers fulfilled their end of the bargain. The entities rose from the depths, not as conquerors, but as partners, their squamous forms mingling with the inhabitants of the town in a grotesque parody of community. The esoteric order of Dagon became the heart of the town, its rituals providing the structure for a life that was increasingly oriented toward the sea. The churches were boarded up or converted, their altars replaced with stone slabs, and their Bibles with the forbidden texts of the abyss. The hymns were replaced by the Dagon chant, a low, vibrating sound that could be heard for miles across the water on a still night. The children born in those years were the first generation of the new Innsmouth, hybrids who belonged to both worlds and neither, their souls already half submerged in the brine. Obed Marsh's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. He was the catalyst, the high priest, and the progenitor. He watched as his town withered and his family changed, his own humanity slipping away with every ritual he performed. He became a figure of myth and terror, a captain who no longer sailed the seas, but who commanded the monsters that dwelt within them. His house on Washington Street became a fortress of silence, a place where the secrets of the pact were guarded with a jealous, murderous intensity. The story of gold from the sea ends not with a resolution, but with a beginning, the beginning of the long, dark night of Innsmouth. It sets the stage for the arrival of the narrator in Lovecraft's original tale, providing the context for the horrors he would encounter in that decaying port. It explains the source of the shadow and the reason for the town's isolation. It reveals that the monsters of Innsmouth are not alien invaders, but the products of human choices, the descendants of a man who wanted to be rich and a town that wanted to be saved. As the fog thickens outside my window, I can almost see the Sumatra ghosting into the harbour, its sails tattered and its hull encrusted with the barnacles of 1,000 fathoms. I can see Obed Marsh standing on the deck, his eyes fixed on the shore, his pockets heavy with the gold of the abyss. He's coming home, and he's bringing the darkness with him. The pact is sealed, the blood has been shed, and the shadow is falling. There is no hope for Innsmouth, and there is no hope for those who find themselves drawn into its salt-crusted embrace. The gold is still there, beneath the waves, waiting for the next ship, the next captain, the next town. The deep ones are patient, and the sea is vast. The story of Obed Marsh is but one chapter in a chronicle that began before the dawn of man and will continue long after the last city has crumbled into the dust. The gold from the sea is the eternal lure, and the abyss is the eternal destination. And as I feel the first cold touch of the water against my feet, I realize that I too am part of the story, a final echoing footnote in the dark and terrible history of the shadow over Innsmouth. The atmosphere of the 1830s, as Marsh first began his experiments, was one of a lingering colonial austerity, clashing with the burgeoning feverish energy of the industrial age. Innsmouth, however, was caught in a stasis of its own making. The salt rot was not merely on the buildings, it was in the very air, a heavy, humid presence that seemed to stifle any attempt at progress. Marsh's return with the Kanak gold was like a spark in a tinderbox, but the fire it lit was not one of warmth, but of a cold, phosphoric consumption. The first ornaments brought back, the tiaras, the bracelets, the strange pectoral plates, were described by those few who saw them as having a disturbing fluidity. They seemed to change shape when not being looked at directly, their surfaces etched with scenes of underwater life that were too detailed, too vibrant to have been made by human hands. The fish depicted on them were not the familiar cod or mackerel of the New England coast, but monstrous abyssal things with multiple fins and glowing lures. The gold itself was soft, yet possessed a tensile strength that defied the blacksmith's hammer. As Marsh's influence grew, so did the secrecy surrounding his operations. The Marsh Refining Company became a place of shadows, its chimneys belching a thick yellowish smoke that smelled of sulphur and dead things. The workers were sworn to oaths of silence, reinforced by the threat of a fate far worse than death. Those who spoke of the things they saw in the melting pots, the way the gold seemed to scream as it was heated, or the strange oily residue it left behind, soon disappeared, their names erased from the town's ledgers. The rituals at Devil's Reef became more elaborate as the 1840s progressed. Marsh was no longer content with simple sacrifices. He began to experiment with the gate, attempting to create a permanent rift between the terrestrial world and the watery realm of the deep ones. He used the gold as a conductor, placing the ornaments in specific patterns upon the black rock of the reef to channel the eldritch energies of the abyss. The results were terrifying. The water around the reef would boil without heat, and strange luminous shapes would be seen moving beneath the surface, even during the brightest part of the day. The hybridization process was the most horrifying aspect of the pact, a slow-motion violation of the laws of nature. It began with the marginalized and the desperate, those who had nothing left to lose and were willing to accept the blessing of the deep ones in exchange for food and gold. But soon it spread to the higher echelons of Innsmouth society. The Gilman, Elliot and Marsh families all participated, their bloodlines becoming hopelessly entangled with the ichor of the abyss. The Innsmouth look became a badge of status within the Order of Dagon, a sign of one's proximity to the Great Ones. The psychological impact on the town was profound. A collective madness settled over the population, a shared delusion that the decay of their bodies was a form of transcendence. They began to hate the sun and the air, finding comfort only in the damp cellars and the lightless tunnels that Marsh had constructed beneath the town. These tunnels connected the houses to the harbour, allowing the deep ones to enter the town unseen and providing a way for the hybrids to reach the water without being noticed by outsiders. The 1846 plague was the culmination of this process, a violent upheaval that served as the final transition. The few remaining normals in the town were either killed or driven out, their homes seized by the order. The town was officially quarantined, a move that Marsh used to his advantage to further isolate his community from the rest of the world. From that point on, Innsmouth was a ghost town to the outside world, a place of rumours and shadows that people avoided at all costs. Obed Marsh's final years were spent in a state of horrific metamorphosis. He no longer looked human, his skin having turned a mottled green-grey, and his eyes having migrated to the sides of his head. He spent most of his time in a specially constructed tank in the basement of his mansion, communicating with his followers through a series of guttural clicks and whistles. He had become a living idol, a bridge between the land and the sea, the physical embodiment of the pact he had made decades before. The legacy of gold from the sea is a reminder that some fortunes are not worth the cost. The wealth that saved Innsmouth from economic ruin also destroyed its soul, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a community that exists only to serve the interests of the things beneath the waves. The gold is still there, a shimmering, deadly lure that continues to draw the unwary into the shadow. And the deep ones are still there, waiting in the darkness of the reef, their unblinking eyes fixed on the shore, waiting for the day when the last of the marsh line returns to the sea and the pact of Obed Marsh is finally complete. The story concludes with the realization that the shadow is not just over Innsmouth, but over all of us. The abyss is always waiting, and the gold is always there, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface of our civilized world. Obed Marsh's pact was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a deeper, more universal malaise, the human desire for power and wealth at any cost, and the terrifying readiness of the cosmos to provide it, for a price that no one can truly afford to pay. The water is rising, the fog is thickening, and the bells of Dagon are tolling. The shadow is here,